Welcome to the Paul Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Welcome to Season 2 of the Paul Street Journal. We are on Episode 1 of our new season. Brian, welcome to Season 2.
Thank you, Freddy.
So, to recap Season 1, which is now long behind us, but still with us for the rest of the season and the rest of the podcast, obviously. In Season 1, we talked about the biblical, the historical, and the philosophical predominantly. Is there something I'm missing?
No, it's good.
So we started with the biblical, and we talked about economic principles that we found or deduced from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then we kind of tried to trace some threads from those principles all throughout the centuries, maybe until we get to roughly the time period that we're going to be talking about in Season 2 and beyond. So we talked about things like the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire. We talked about barbarians. We talked about kingdoms. We talked about war, and then we got to mercantilism. We got to the discovery of the New World. We got to a bunch of different things. We got and tried to trace the threads of the church being involved in all of that. We talked about monasticism, universities, hospitals, all very economic things. And then towards the later half of our podcast, we got to the philosophical. We got to Adam Smith and, the beginning of modern economics as a science, the wealth of nations. And then after him, a lot of other philosophers that maybe were fruits of, the philosophers were very different from Christian philosophers, Catholic philosophers, and we made the claims that a lot of that was fruit of the Enlightenment and the Protestant, what we called revolution. And so we talked about socialism, we talked about capitalism with Adam Smith, we briefly talked about fascism. And again, those things in existence with the church and the church's responses to all of these things. Then, after Season 1 was over, we had this special episode with Father Paul Manning, or I hope I got it right, Father. And we talked about dogma, we talked about doctrine, and we talked about encyclicals. And that episode was, hopefully it stood alone and some people could listen to it and learn something about those topics. But it was primarily to prepare us for Season 2, because in Season 2, we're going to be talking specifically about that. Primarily doctrine and encyclicals, because as we said in that episode, encyclicals are about Catholic doctrine. So, to get us started, I want to point out some new changes in the studio first and foremost.
If you're watching.
If you're watching. If you're not watching, I'm sorry. Maybe we'll post a picture somewhere. So before, all we had was the Summa. It's fancy Latin Summa that looks like it's falling apart. And this season, we've added a nice collection of the papal encyclicals. And I didn't do it. I think Brian did. So you want to say a quick word about them?
No, it's just that we have them at the library here at St. Paul Inside the Walls, and Pope Leo, who we're going to be discussing today, wrote 80 plus encyclicals himself. I don't think he used even a secretary. And
what a guy.
So we have his
so
encyclicals.
A big chunk of these are his.
A large percentage of these are from him, and from, I think we have them all the way up until the late 1900s here.
Nice.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the word on our studio. So let's jump into Season 2. This was a long anticipated episode, I think, because, if you're interested in economics and Catholic economics, you probably are familiar with Rerum Novarum. Mm-hmm. Pope Leo XIII's big kind of, what's a word that I want to use? Kind of like a groundbreaking encyclical if we're looking back.
Yeah, I think this is regarded by most as the foundational document of modern Catholic social teaching in general.
Right.
And it includes a lot of things about economics. It's primarily economics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's a wonderful place to start for Season 2, and we've anticipated this. This was the thing I didn't want to be spoiled all throughout Season 1. I say it many times that I didn't want us to spoil the fact that we were doing this. But here we are. So before getting into the encyclical itself and what Pope Leo says about economics and other things, why are we talking about economics? Because in the previous episode with Father Paul, our special episode, he mentioned that people say that Pope Francis wrote infallibly on climate change, but then Father Paul's response was he can't write infallibly on climate change because he can only write infallibly on faith and morals, and climate change is a science. So following that same thought, isn't economics a science? We said that Adam Smith started this modern science of economics. So why is Pope Leo, as we say, writing on a science?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and I think it's a question that Pope Leo asks in Rerum Novarum and answers. So if you look at Rerum Novarum paragraph 2, he gives a justification for writing about economics. Does the church have guidance, directions, provide principles for how to deal with certain sciences? The answer is yeah, all the time. So in regards to biological issues, biology is a science. Does the church have guidance on the morality of birthing related things, conception related things, end of life issues?
Yes.
Absolutely, right? Has Pope Francis written on the moral obligations of Catholics in regards to climate change? Yes. So is the church making scientific proclamations, pronouncements? Probably not. But it is laying moral doctrine, groundwork for how to think and how to act in relationship to these sciences.
Right.
And that's the church's responsibility. So Pope Leo, he does say, like, this is tricky and it's a little dangerous for the church to be talking about this stuff. But we're going to talk about who Leo is. There's no better person to talk about it than Leo.
Yeah, right. And I like your response. And I think you're right that Pope Leo also does kind of say, I'm not proclaiming anything scientific, but he as, the Pope, as the universal pontiff and the shepherd of all God's people, he feels like he has a duty to address a problem. But
Yes.
before we get to that, and a moral duty, the economics is a science, but it has moral consequences in a sense. But before we get to that, I want to know a little bit more about Pope Leo, because you said he's a perfect guy to write this encyclical. And why is that?
Yeah, so, well, let's just talk about Leo as a person as fast as we can so we can get into the document. So he was the son of a very religious, well-to-do family. He was very well educated, and there is evidence of Leo writing poems in Latin by age 11 or 12.
Wow.
So this guy knows what he's doing. It was kind of like Father Paul Manning, writing poems. His brother was a priest, so Pope Leo ended up becoming a diocesan priest. His brother became a Jesuit priest. I think they celebrated their first mass together, which is
How cute.
So Leo got a doctorate in not just one subject, but 3, which is very impressive.
Yeah.
So theology, obviously,
Right.
civil law, so he was a lawyer, and then finally canon law. So he was a multi-disciplined person, and as a result, knew about the intersection of certain subjects, which I think is really important. Pope Francis just wrote an apostolic constitution in 2023, last year, and it talks about the need for theology to permeate other fields of study. So 130 years before Pope Francis talks about this, Leo was fulfilling that. So soon after becoming a priest, and even while he was studying to be a priest, maybe, I think the Pope of that time needed help with administrating hospitals. So Leo was involved with all that. He was just doing with the administration and making hospitals better. This is kind of like in the line of Bishop Landry. Remember from like medieval times, we're still, as a church, the primary source of healthcare at this moment in the Papal States. Soon after being ordained, Pope Leo he's just a priest, he's not a pope yet, and he is put in charge of the smallest province in the Papal States with just about 20,000 people. And just because it's small doesn't mean it's easy. He found it to be a huge challenge because the whole economy was being run by corrupt people. The mafia was involved, and Pope Leo, he wasn't a pope yet, but his first idea was, I got to fix the economy of this little place. So he ended up arresting mafia members, like getting rid of corruption. It wasn't just like thugs, but it was also part of the aristocracy who was involved with this. right? So he kind of went through an investigation, like a detective, and like rooted out the mafia and all this. Then he started establishing trade laws, regulations, and creating trade relationships with neighboring provinces. So building up the economy of his area. Remember, back then, if you were, the church was taking care of the spiritual needs, but also had temporal power and was responsible for civil law,
right,
which Pope Leo studied, right?
Yeah.
And also economic law, right? So Pope Leo was actually like doing this as a young priest. And things went so well in that little province that he was then given a province 10 times the size with a little less than 250,000 people.
Wow.
Doing the same sorts of things, focusing on the economy and many other things. So from an economics perspective, he knew what he was doing. He was a theologian. His economic policies were very much driven by his philosophy, which was rather Thomistic. So it's very good that we have the Summa here right next to the papal encyclicals. So Leo was a philosopher, a theologian, a lawyer, an economist,
right?
Really,
yeah. Following Pope Francis is following before he even advised us to let theology be kind of informed by other fields, and the expertise of other fields.
I think when Francis is saying multidisciplinary studies is a good thing, I think that he's following a 1,000-year-old way of thinking, but too often I think theologians get boxed in and become unrelatable to other people and to other fields. That's what Francis is talking about, and that what Leo fulfilled so long ago.
Hey everyone, it's me. Sorry for interrupting the show. I'm sure I probably interrupted Brian talking, so it's okay. But I just want to jump in to say that if you're liking the Paul Street Journal and you want to see more content like it, please do like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so that you're notified when we have any new releases. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comment section and we'll try our very best to respond to them later on in the episodes. Also, make sure to check out the other shows that are produced by the diocese. Those shows are Beyond the Beacon with Bishop Kevin Sweeney, which you can find on Bishop Kevin Sweeney's YouTube channel, and Coffee with Cupkey with Father Paul Manning and Monsignor Raymond Cupkey, which you can find right here on the St. Paul Inside the Walls YouTube channel. With all that said, thank you. Let's get back to the show.
So this is very interesting, but by the time Pope Leo XIII becomes Pope, the Papal States are gone, and Italy forms into a nation. So Italy, as we know it today, comes into existence and the Papal States are gone, and the Pope has no temporal authority, really, except over maybe the Vatican City, right? So Leo, who is so well equipped to run an economy, to run a province, to run the Papal States, has no territory. But he is a scholar, he's a philosopher, and he probably asked himself, like, what do I do with myself now that we don't have any territory? And what does he do? He writes 80 plus encyclicals. And I think I mentioned that he, like most popes have a secretary who write encyclicals for them. He was doing most of the writing himself. So he's a very impressive guy, prolific writer, and he's watching what's happening, even in Italy. Of course, in the United States, there's tons of stuff going on with the economy, industrialization, capitalism, right? Same thing in Britain and other places, but it's also happening in Italy. And he knows, he's watching in real time what's happening to the new Italy and what's happening with industrialization, farmers leaving their lands either by force or by choice to work in factories in urban settings, right? So he starts writing about this stuff. He writes about so much stuff. He has an encyclical called Providentissimus Deus, which is about reading scripture. He writes an encyclical about dueling.
Like with swords?
Or guns, right? He writes encyclicals about economics, all sorts of things. So
he had too much time on his hands without the Papal States.
Yeah. He is the Pope of the Catholic Church who officially abolishes slavery. So that's a thread that we've been talking about for a long time. And I think it's in the 1880s or 1890s, he officially makes slavery unacceptable for any practicing Catholic. So interestingly, you can't classify Pope Leo as left-winged or right-winged. He doesn't fit that model, which we've talked about. You can't put him in a box politically. He is very effective with his pen. I think the pen is mightier than the sword in this case, right? And then finally, I think this is very interesting. He is the first, I think he's the, Joe, what's the right terminology in regards to him being recorded?
He was the earliest born person to ever be recorded.
Okay, so while we're filming this, I think Joe, maybe you could have the video playing because it's very impressive. The earliest born person, I think he was born in 1810, and no person born younger than that has ever been recorded on video.
Yeah, that's cool. That's the coolest fact out of all the ones.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
And
he looks really small. If you watch the video, he looks like a small man.
Oh, he was old. He was really old back then when the recording was done. So I hope that wasn't too much detail, but it's important to know that this was he was a great writer, philosopher, lawyer, theologian, right? But he was also an administrator, and he understood economics and ran equities himself, right? And that's the background to this encyclical.
Yeah, I appreciate the detail because I think it really does show how well equipped. Like you said, he's the perfect person to write this. And, I could say, yeah, of course, he was a pope. But I didn't know most of these things, how many doctorates he had. I didn't know how many responsibilities he had in the provinces of the papal states. And it really does show that he's not, because when I first read this, I was like, oh, wow, this pope was so brilliant. I wonder what it is. But, well, he's the pope. Holy Spirit probably gave him some help. So that was so good.
True.
Right.
Which is true. Yeah.
That is true. But, it helps to know how well equipped he actually was. He had practical experience, which wasn't just, so these aren't just thoughts of his. This is experience that he lived through. And he's like, and it shows. This is such a wonderful, treasure chest of a document, I think. And I'm excited to get into it.
Great. So another thing we should talk about is the economy that is existing as Pope Leo writes Rerum Novarum. So we have some pictures, Joe, that we could show. So, we could show pictures from late 1800s Italy, late 1800s Britain, other places, but this is New York City. So in the late 1800s, what do we get? We get an industrial economy, a capitalistic economy. There's major monopolistic practices going on, consolidation, conglomeration, right? And land is being gobbled up by large developers, and people are being forced, for one reason or another, to give up property that they maybe owned, and moving into an urban environment where they pay rent to live, and they become not a self-sustaining farmer like the majority of people were maybe beforehand, but now they're totally dependent on selling their labor for a wage, proletarianism, so that they can pay rent, buy food, and if they lose that job, they're gone. So employers knowing that, we talked about Adam Smith, they're treating their labor like commodities, finding the cheapest source of labor, worrying more about their profits probably than the laborers themselves. And the structures that people lived in and the conditions that they lived in these urban settings were pitiful.
Yeah.
Pitiful.
Yeah, the picture shows it.
And there's also a major change, not just in the economy, but in the societal structures. So in the medieval period, we talked about the aristocracy, the monarchy, the priestly class, the merchant class, the tradesmen, and the peasants, and how even the lowest class of peasants started being raised up to a much higher level than in the era of serfdom or even slavery that pre-existed serfdom, right? So what we see here now is that in the industrial economy, there's really just two classes. The aristocracy and the monarchy are basically gone. The two classes now are capital, people who own the means of production, factories, industry, and then labor, people who don't own anything and work for wages. So these two brand new structures, two classes, are kind of the new reality of the economy. And then finally, there's a major change in families. So remember in the medieval time, there's that idea of private property and locational stability where a family could occupy an estate for hundreds of years. Just as in, maybe the time of Joshua in the Old Testament and beyond. And by the way, those large family estates would have not just a nuclear family, but an extended family, maybe like a grandmother and a grandfather, but then all of their children would have their own house on that estate. So no one was fighting to get land. They would use the land that they had and just build a new house for their little family. And the education, the health care, the elderly care, that was all done like for each other, right? The extended family system. This is, I married into an African family. This is how Africans still think, right? And maybe you have that experience with your family in Latin America,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely, yeah.
So this is still a thing in many parts of the world, but in the industrialized nations, what we see is a new type of family model, which is the isolated nuclear family, where a father and a mother have to work to make money. They have to go to work even if their kid doesn't go to sleep all night, right? So they have to handle a house, job, kids, cleaning, all this stuff like by themselves alone, which anyone who tries this in the United States know that it's not possible. You're not going to succeed and thrive in many respects. So that's kind of like the economic and societal situation in which Rerum Novarum is about to be written.
Right. Yeah, and I think Leo focuses on that a lot. I think he one societal structure, though of course it had its problems, was like more stable than the new one. And I think he's going to get into that and perhaps offer a solution, because I think that's what Leo does. Do you think it's time to get into the document itself?
Yes, I think it's probably best to read, and these are going to be long quotes,
right?
But we'll put them up on the screen if you're watching. And Freddy, maybe you can read these slowly so that those who are only listening could really let it sink in. So these are long quotes, but our podcast's doctrine, no. Our encyclicals, generally, yes. So it's important that you hear from the voice of Leo here, and let this sink in. We're going to only read. There's many paragraphs in this document.
Like
we're only going to
plus.
There's 60 plus paragraphs. We're only going to read 3 verbatim.
Right.
And so just give these paragraphs the attention they deserve just 3 times.
Right. I want to make 2 preliminary notes before we even get into that. So, like you say, we want to be listening to the voice of Leo. My recommendation many times throughout this podcast has been to go read the document itself, just because it's, like I said, a treasure chest. And, as Catholics, we want to go to the source of these things. Like you said, podcasts are not doctrine. If you want to learn doctrine, you got to read doctrine. So that's, we know some of you are still not going to read it, so we're going to read it for you. I'm just teasing. And then the other note is, in light of the episode we had with Father Paul about doctrine, just really as you're reading or listening, to pay attention to Leo's language. We talked about doctrine being binding on Catholics, and that having weight, it's authority that we should listen to. So I also want to make that note so that we listen to Leo in light of that. So I'll now start reading paragraph 1, which is a little long and weighty, but I'll read it slowly. That the spirit of revolutionary change, which has long been disturbing the nations of the world, should have passed beyond the sphere of politics and made its influence felt in the cognate sphere of practical economics is not surprising. The elements of the conflict now raging are unmistakable in the vast expansion of industrial pursuits and the marvelous discoveries of science, in the changed relations between masters and workmen, in the enormous fortunes of some few individuals and the utter poverty of the masses, the increased self-reliance and closer mutual combination of the working classes, as also, finally, in the prevailing moral degeneracy. The momentous gravity of the state of things now obtaining fills every mind with painful apprehension. Wise men are discussing it, practical men are proposing schemes, popular meetings, legislatures, and rulers of nations are all busied with it. Actually, there is no question which has taken deeper hold on the public mind. So I think Leo is really painting the picture that there's this ginormous problem that concerns us all, right? And we'll read, I think, paragraph 3 as well. He's going to be more specific about what the problem is. But any thoughts on paragraph 1?
Just a couple of comments on this paragraph. So he talks first about the spirit of revolutionary change. So we called the Protestant Reformation the Protestant Revolution, right? This idea, it's more of like a departure from foundational principles than a return to, right? That's how there's almost like a violence
Right.
that's connected to this word revolution. Now, that's more conceptual, the Protestant Reformation, right? More literal is the actual revolutions. So the American Revolution, which we talked about in season 1, the French Revolution, which we talked about in season 1. Those were violent revolutions,
Right.
with guns, right? And
Guillotine.
yeah, so those violent revolutions, what were they getting rid of? What were they fighting? It was the monarchy, right? And that's a political change. And what is Leo saying? He's like, it's not surprising that political change has led to economic change.
Right.
And change could be good or bad, right? Leo is not a romantic, right? He is not saying, oh, I wish the past would come back, right? But he's also saying not all change is good. Sometimes change is bad. And what we're talking about here needs to be really thought of in an intentional way. So I think it's worth mentioning that he talks about the discoveries of science and industrialization, which is huge. He talks about the utter poverty of the masses and the majority of wealth being in the hands of very few people, which is a newer reality. Did that exist before? Yes, but the gap between rich and poor has widened
Right.
in the industrial capitalistic system. And then finally, he talks about the prevailing moral degeneracy, right? Which is worth noting. We'll talk more about that later. So let's get into paragraph 3.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to quickly note too that, we talked about revolution versus reform. And I think what we've tried to do in this podcast is say that genuine reform is good. We want to reform. That's what we said the church does. Keeps the good, gets rid of the bad. That's reform. Revolution, like you say, is this departure from,
Foundational principles,
right,
yeah.
the true good principles. So we will now read paragraph 3, which will be a little bit more specific about what the issue is. So paragraph 3. In any case, we clearly see, and on this there is general agreement, that some opportune remedy must be found quickly for the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class. For the ancient working men's guilds were abolished in the last century, and no other protective organization took their place. Public institutions and the laws set aside the ancient religion. Hence, by degrees it has come to pass that working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. The mischief has been increased by rapacious usury, which, although more than once condemned by the church, is nevertheless under a different guise, but with like injustice, still practiced by covetous and grasping men. To this must be added that the hiring of labor and the conduct of trade are concentrated in the hands of comparatively few, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. So that one is big, and I think it reminds us of someone, like that complaint about what is going on.
Well, if we were to combine, Freddy, paragraphs 1 and 3, it sounds exactly like the Communist Manifesto. Right. So maybe that's an overstatement, exactly. But his complaints about the industrial capitalistic economy in paragraphs 1 and 3 here model very closely the Communist Manifesto with Engels and Marx, right? So there's only one thing, because he's talking about usury, he's talking about greed, he's talking about the isolation of people, right?
Yeah, he's talking about the change in the societal structure too that we mentioned.
Societal structure, rich and poor, rich versus poor in many senses, and many other things, right? So the only thing that he adds that Marx and Engels didn't add is the moral degeneracy.
Right.
So that seems to be a particular concern of the Pope, that the Pope is concerned about and observes that either Marx and Engels didn't observe, or they did observe and they didn't care, right? Marx and Engels themselves, maybe had no problem with that. So, and it's funny, the Pope that abolishes slavery is the Pope here that says that the industrial poor, the proletariat, they're living a life little better than slavery, right? So it's almost like a return to season 1, episode 4 of the Wall Street Journal, where the majority of the Roman population is slaves.
Right.
It's almost like it's like a regression that he's observing. So he agrees with Marx and Engels mostly in the problem.
Right.
Right? Now, what could not be more different between the Communist Manifesto and Rerum Novarum is the solution. So I think any good lawyer, he's a lawyer, remember, Leo.
Civil and canonical.
Yeah, any good lawyer or any good arguer will agree with his or her opponent as much as possible before disagreeing. Because what are you doing? You're saying, yeah, we're in agreement, except now. That you're building relationship and trust by agreeing as long as you can. And that's what Leo's doing to socialists primarily, right?
Yeah, I think he's, in a sense, validating that concern. He's like, you guys are right to be concerned about this because I am too.
Right.
And then after paragraph 3, he goes on for a few paragraphs
About socialism.
Yep. And saying that they're utterly wrong for a variety of reasons, which we won't specifically get into, but he does basically say socialism is the wrong solution because it makes it worse.
Yep.
One of his main concerns is that socialism will make the working class the first class to suffer with this new solution. And he gets into it, and I think he does it very, very well.
We're not going to get, we spend an episode talking about how socialism does not fit Catholic social teaching, but we encourage everybody to read paragraphs 4 and beyond where he convincingly says that socialism would not work if it were ever tried. Because remember, at this point in 1891, no country has tried it yet.
Yeah, and I think once we do get to his solution, we'll see why socialism that we talked about in season 1 wouldn't work. A lot of his solution is kind of what, like you said, they're so different. His solution versus the socialist solution. And we'll see that once we get into his.
Yeah. The socialist solution is strategic and tactical, while Pope Leo's solution is philosophical and filled with principles, which are guidelines for how to think and act, not just from a governmental macroeconomic perspective, but also from the perspective of a laborer, a father, somebody who owns a little estate, and so forth. So the principles guide multiple parties and classes and constructs within society.
Right. So
that's the right word.
Let's get into the first part of his solution, which is the philosophy. What is the philosophy behind Leo's solution?
Yeah, so Adam Smith says the wealth of nations is in its productivity, right? The types of products it produces, GDP, and all this kind of stuff. But what was it? Bonald, Louis Bonald. In season 1, he was saying it's what? He
says it's like the morality of a nation.
Yeah,
and he said that Adam Smith knows nothing about the true wealth of nations.
yeah. So what does Leo say throughout this book, throughout this document? He's basically saying that it's the virtue of the populace that is the true wealth. And that virtuous men who are practicing kenosis, practicing justice, that is the solution. So charity, agape, right? Like these philosophies and ways of thinking is the solution. Right. So, and that's so disappointing to any scientist.
Yeah.
Right? But it's just a philosophical approach and way of thinking, and from there, he provides more concrete ways in which to make that society come to be.
Right. I think it's also similar to what we've tried to point out in season 1, that most of the time the church doesn't offer the system that solves the problem. It's let's return to the heart of the problem. Let's, hearts over systems or hearts over whatever it was.
That's what he's saying.
Right.
Hearts over systems.
Right.
Yeah. And the isms are mechanistic ways or attempts to make a great economy. It's more strategic and tactical. And that's not what we're saying will ever work. Tactics and strategies are very good and very important, but only in the context of a philosophy, a way of seeing God, the world, creation, economics, and other people.
Yeah, like a worldview.
Yeah.
So you mentioned already that Leo is not a romantic, and he's not just wanting to return to that which was great before. He's very thoughtful, and he wants to preserve the good and do away with the bad.
Yeah, so he he does complain that the modernistic political and economic system have destroyed the ancient working guilds. And those were good things. He complains. But what he's not doing is saying we need to get rid of capitalism and we need to replace it with some older system. That's not what he's saying.
Right.
So that would be romantic to say, let's go back to the past.
Right.
He never says that. He complains, right? But then says, okay, we're not going to go back to the past. We need to find a new path forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a quote that I really like because it kind of embodies what we said about Leo and how any system or any solution needs to be built upon this philosophy or the principles. And I'll read it quickly. It's in paragraph 27 for those of you that want to read the document. He says, when a society is perishing, the wholesome advice to give those who would restore it is to call it to the principles from which it sprang. For the purpose and perfection of an association is to aim at and to attain that for which it is formed, and its efforts should be put in motion and inspired by the end and object which originally gave it being. So I think he answers, like I used to think, can Leo be romantic in a way? Like he's kind of complaining about this new system. Maybe he wants to go back. But I think that, like you've said, it's not the system he wants to go back to. It's
the principles.
Right.
And truth doesn't change. So economies change, times change. The addition of new technologies changes things, really like creates a lot of dust, right? And the dust has to settle, but the principles are always guiding us through the murky waters, right? So in that paragraph 27, he says, we're calling ourselves back to the first principles. This is like an originalistic way of thinking. It's not romantic, right? It's saying that what Jesus told us 2,000 years ago, what Moses told us 1,200 years before that, those are all still true.
Yeah, that's a nice distinction.
Yeah.
That it's originalistic, not romantic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So in that paragraph that you just read, he says, go back to the original principles. He lists and describes those principles in this document. And that's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, and he does it in detail. So we're going to try to do it justice.
We're going to try, but there's no replacement for reading the document. And listening to this podcast episode will probably help highlight some of these things that Leo's talking about. And it'll also help in making connections to the biblical and philosophical and historical things that we brought up in the last season too.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think we can jump into the principles now, and I think that we agreed that the first and foremost principle, the most important one that kind of guides the rest of the document, is the dignity of the human person.
Yeah.
And so what would we say about the dignity of the human person from Leo's?
Well, the reason why he's talking about dignity is because he's not seeing dignity in the industrial capitalistic world of his time. So the laborers are being treated as little better than slaves. They are totally dependent on their employer for their livelihood. They don't own their house. They don't own their means of production. They're underpaid. They work in unsafe environments. Joe, you could post a photo of child labor, which becomes common just for families to survive. Children are robbed of their livelihood, of their childhood, I should say. And they're paid even less because they're kids. They just get paid less.
Yeah.
And it's just a sad state of society. Right. So the labor situation is an affront to human dignity. So he goes back to that first principle, which we talked about in our New Testament episode. Did Jesus invent the idea of human dignity? No, but he really brings it to a next level. He puts the dignity of individuals even above and beyond a local economy. Right? We talked about that.
With the swine.
Yeah.
I think we called it infinite dignity, right?
Yeah, which is a bold statement.
But I think Leo would agree, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he tells workers that he tells employers that they are bound. Remember, like we talked about the binding nature of doctrine. This is a doctrinal encyclical.
Right.
So in Matthew 16, Jesus gives the first Pope Peter and later in Matthew 18, the rest of the apostles the power to bind and loose. So that binding function is being utilized. And in this moment, Leo says, employers are bound not to look upon their work people as bondsmen, kind of like slaves, but to respect every man in his dignity as a person ennobled by Christian character. So what does this worker need to survive? What does this worker need to thrive? If I could find cheaper labor, do I just get rid of this one for a cheaper one? Like, all these questions need to be asked by employers, and the dignity of each worker needs to be taken into account, is what he's saying here.
Right. And one thing I want to point out is that maybe that doesn't sound super specific, maybe as like a solution where you have to treat him with dignity. And then the worker may say, or the employer might say, okay, I'll do that. Bye. And then he maybe continues, gives him a little bit more money. But I think later on in the document, which we'll get to later, I think Leo does give a bit more specific.
He does, yeah.
Advice. So I think these principles, and the advice is built upon these principles. So I just wanted to note that.
Yeah, we'll get into the details, but you got to wait.
Yes,
you gotta
do.
wait.
Listen to the whole thing. And I think that's more or less it for the dignity of the human person. Like, for us, it might be clear, we say safe conditions for work, a fair wage. We want to treat a human being like, simply as we'd like to be treated. Maybe that's an easy way for employers to think about it. But again, we'll get to more specifics later. I think that the next principle, which Leo says is essentially one of the most important, or the most important, but we'll qualify that, is private property and, in a sense, locational stability. And he calls it the most important, but I think it's because it's built upon the dignity of the human person. Private property is related to the person who has that property.
Yeah.
So in Leo's words, he says that the first and most fundamental principle, therefore, if one would undertake to alleviate the condition of the masses, must be the inviolability of private property, which is a dense statement. Again, this is doctrinal. He's saying the first and fundamental principle, which we said he's a very principled this is a very principled solution. He says it's private property. So let's unpack that. What does that mean?
Well, he doesn't call it the first and fundamental principle. He calls it the first and most fundamental principle to alleviate the problem, like the condition of the masses.
Right.
Truly, the first fundamental principle is the dignity of the human person. But in the context that he's talking about, private property is the solution. So this might not make sense alone, this principle alone, because you can't tell a proletarian in the late 1800s, like, oh, you need private property, because they can't obtain it. There's no way. There's no way out for them. But that it is the foundational solution to the problem. So this principle, combined with others that we're going to talk about later, will solve the problem. Remember, we talked about the Pope's rejection of socialism. He's talking about it here, private property, as part of the solution, in direct contradiction to what Marx and Engels are saying in the Communist Manifesto. What's the problem, according to Marx and Engels? It's private property, right? If everything became public and owned by the government, that would solve our problems, right? Leo's saying, absolutely not. You're wrong.
Yeah.
Socialists, you're wrong.
Yeah. It's a direct rejection.
Yeah. And just stating that private property is important isn't going to be enough. There's going to be other things that have to be said to make it possible. But as a father of a family, your incentive, your desire for going to work and making money, let's say, is to help your family thrive, to have your little estate, to make it more productive, to make it more beautiful, to make your own situation better, and then finally, once your situation is good enough, to help others. So that's the incentive. The incentive is the wellspring, the source of labor and the economy as a result, right? So he's saying that private property is a foundational, essential component to even the motivation to work.
Yeah, I think Leo does that beautifully in the document itself. Like he uses very biblical language to kind of point out why private property is, you can't do away with it. It's fundamental to work. He has this quote which I love, which we'll read, about, your property being the fruit of your work and, the wage in another form. So he says, which we'll unpack a little more, thus, if he lives sparingly, saves money, and for greater security invests his savings in land, the land in such case is only his wages under another form. and consequently a working man's little estate thus purchased should be as completely at his full disposal as are the wages he receives for his labor. Like you said, it's completely a rejection of socialism and saying that this is his because if his wages are his, this is just his wages in a different form. And I think that what Leo does beautifully, which I would really recommend reading, I think paragraph 7 is he points out that private property is kind of man's tool for providing for his livelihood. Once you take away private property, you kind of take away his means of sustenance, and he does it beautifully in a way that
of sustenance over a period of time.
Right.
Yeah. So like he talks about the brute, or an animal. Like what makes a human being so different than other animals? It's primarily the intellect and the ability to plan ahead. So an ox is thinking about now. Like I'm hungry, I'm gonna reach down and eat some grass. But the ox isn't thinking like, okay, 10 years down the road, I'm going to be this age and I need to have this many things done to sustain myself and my family, right? So property allows parents to sustain their family into the future. Personal property allows for that. So he's making that connection between what makes a human different,
right?
And the dignity associated with humanity has to do with intellect, and he attaches that to the need for property to sustain oneself.
Yeah, and I think he says essentially that if capitalism and socialism rob the human, because they rob the person of their property, they kind of rob them of that ability to plan ahead. Like the proletarian doesn't really have that ability to plan ahead because he's just thinking day by day, I need this labor to provide for my food today, kind of like an animal.
Yeah, you're reduced to a more animalistic existence.
Right.
Yeah.
And
you become totally dependent.
Right, exactly.
In that environment, on the government or whatever else.
Right.
Yeah. Even an employer in a monopolistic environment.
Right. What I also like about Leo's words about private property is that he says that even the divine law adds its sanction. So he uses very biblical language. And again, this is like, he's trying to make this as binding as he can. And he says that the divine law adds its sanction essentially with the 9th and 10th commandment, which by severe authority, the commandments are one of the most binding things we have. We cannot even covet that which is another's Like the property of someone else, it is a sin to covet it, to desire it for myself.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah,
1,200 years before Jesus, no one was thinking that, they could control their actions, but to control the way one thinks, to control what one desires, I mean, those are groundbreaking laws that were made in the 10 Commandments. So unique. So basically, you're not even allowed to want somebody else's stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's telling, I think it just gives it that gravity and that magnitude with what he's trying to say about private property. So I think private property and human dignity are probably some of the, like we said, most important. So we took a little bit longer on those.
Yeah, let's fly through these.
The others will probably go a little faster through. So what is next?
Human solidarity. So Marx and Engels argue that the new industrial capitalistic economy leads to two classes: those with capital and those without, the laborers, and that they are in an epic battle for supremacy and that they clash with one another.
Yeah, always.
Always, yeah. So, and they see history in general as a class warfare kind of like narrative. So that's a lot different than harmony. So as a poor person, like, is it your duty as a Christian to just hate all rich people? No. It's okay if you're a poor person to love rich people. It's okay if you're a rich person to love a poor person. And there's all kinds of people in the middle.
Good, not just
in fact,
okay.
It's not just okay, it's encouraged, right? Because all people are people, created beings, created by God with infinite dignity. So to see somebody of a different economic class as like an enemy, or to see yourself as better than them, is just not acceptable in Christianity. Right. So this idea of a love for one's neighbor is an essential principle and component.
Right. Yeah. And I think Leo takes it as far to say that, the distinction of working class and the capital class, like different classes, it's not just a concession. Like he kind of paints a picture that it's a good thing. If it builds if it's in a harmonic structure, it's good that there's this distinction between classes, because it kind of just works in, like, if there's harmony.
Yeah, I don't think Leo would say that the two-class system in the industrial capitalistic economy is good.
Yeah.
But what Pope Leo's not against is a strata of different classes.
Yeah.
So in the medieval times, let's say, where there was like many classes, he says that that's good, right? And in the future economy that maybe will come under the principles of Catholic social teaching, if there were many different classes, economic classes, Pope Leo would argue that that's okay. It's important. Everybody has different intellectual capabilities. Everybody has different skill sets.
Right.
Diversity is good. Just imagine if everybody had the same amount of money, everybody had the same amount of skills, the same type of skills. That would be a static economy. So the diversity is good. And it's okay if there's disparity, as long as it's not unjust.
Right. Yeah. That sounds like a boring life too, not just a static economy.
Right, but that's kind of what is the socialistic proposal.
Right. So, and I think, again, we'll quote Leo again, because he paints a beautiful picture about this strata when there's justice and harmony. So he says, just as the symmetry of the human frame is the result of the suitable arrangement of the different parts of the body, so in a state is it ordained by nature that these two classes should dwell in harmony and agreement, so as to maintain the balance of the body politic. And again, I think he's not saying that these are good things in and of themselves, but in this harmonic, just structure, it's good, essentially. And it can be good, like you say, in this strata that is acceptable and everyone's getting what they deserve in a just manner. I think that is what he means. And that builds this solidarity that we're talking about.
Yeah. And he's defining justice without defining it here. Because what's justice according to Marx and Engels? Everybody has the same amount of wealth. What's just according to Leo and to people with common sense? People get what they earn or deserve. So a person, two people who have the same amount of, like, the same start in life, who have the same amount of intelligence, the same skills, one works harder and one doesn't. Would it be just if there was a disparity in their wealth? Yes, it would be just, right? Because one worked harder than the other. So the disparity isn't the problem, but there needs to be a very high low. Just like slave is too low, serf is too low. Peasant, in certain times of the medieval period, was so much higher, so much more dignified. So we want that lowest part of society to be as high as it could be.
Right. Yeah. And I like that you mentioned that, because I like to think about justice not only after the fact, like two people in the same starting position, and then one's actions take him to somewhere and the other's actions take him lower than that person. To end up there, it is just. But when I like to think about justice, and at least how Leo speaks about it, he talks about kind of this natural order, where like some things in the natural order, there will be discrepancies and where one person starts and the other, but that's okay. Like, as long as this person has what God gives him and this person has what God gives him, if they're in different places but they receive everything that God has given them, that's just, and it's good. Not only, what they do after the fact, if that makes any sense.
It does. And I think in the system that's being proposed by Leo, there's always room for advancement. No one's stuck where they are, which I think is an important point to make.
Absolutely.
There's always room for growth, which he even talks about. If he lives sparingly, saves money, he improves his situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so next in the principles is freedom and responsibility of discernment. So all of these sound pretty familiar, don't they? They come from our Old Testament, New Testament principles, and that we mentioned in season 1. And we're going to talk about this in more detail later. We're going to read paragraph 20 at the end of our episode, which he's so specific on what this looks like. Yeah. But just to fly through this real quick for the moment, he talks about the responsibility that workers have for thinking about the dignity and the needs of workers. Right? He talks about how workers, when they get paid, how they should think in taking care of their family, and then in taking care of the poor once their family is taken care of. Right. All right? So that moral or ethical muscle that was written into the law of Moses. Remember, the Mosaic law was very specific in some laws, but then gave freedom in other laws. So that muscle that God introduces into Mosaic law is now being fully enacted in the New Testament in the age of the Holy Spirit, and Pope Leo is affirming and confirming that.
Yeah.
In the principles of Rerum Novarum.
Right. I like the image. I think the responsibility is, I like responsibility, and I think it's more fitting than the freedom, perhaps, because there is this freedom where we are free, like no one's forcing us to be responsible.
Yeah, we're not helping the poor under any law of compulsion.
Yeah.
Right? We do so because we want to, because we're inspired by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and our desire to respond.
Yeah, right.
That's the freedom.
Yeah.
I think I'm more driven personally by my freedom than my responsibility. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next is seasons and holidays. So again, paragraph 20 is going to mention this, but employers need to respect the fact that every laborer needs rest and needs the time to worship, specifically on Sundays. So this sounds obvious and is not surprising at all until you think about today and realize that that's not the case, right? Bergen County in New Jersey is one of the few places where, like, if you want to go to IKEA in New Jersey, you got to go to Elizabeth because it's closed in Paramus. Okay, the next paragraph, the next principle is stewardship, which I think we could have explained better in episode 3 on the New Testament. But remember that we as Catholics need to see ourselves and our resources, our money, our properties, our skills, our talents. We need to see ourselves as stewards. St. Paul and the New Testament authors would probably use the word oikonomos, with the root word being economy, right? So what is an oikonomos? What is a steward? Is it somebody who owns property and uses it as they please? No, a steward is a person who manages somebody else's stuff.
Right.
So whose stuff is our stuff?
God's stuff.
God's stuff. It's God's stuff. And
some good theology going on.
I know. It's like we're using technical words here. So if everything that we have is from God, is a gift from God, it's not ours.
Right.
And we have to apportion our resources as God would for God, right? And doesn't this sound like a contradiction to private property?
A little. It
Right?
does.
So it's almost like a paradox. So from the government's eyes, is the government allowed to seize somebody's property for the common good? No. But from the owners, let's say a man and a woman, a husband and wife, they own property. Do they see that as their own? No, they see it as God's. And they use it as God would use it. And they're using their resources according to the principles of Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, I think stewardship, at least for me, feels very connected to the responsibility of discernment. We have this responsibility to be stewards, and I think Leo points that out very clearly. Again, we have more quotes from him, but he essentially does kind of, if he does point out that private property is fundamental for your own sustenance, he continues that thread and he says, first, once your family is taken care of with the private property, that which goes over is essentially it's not yours, and you are to give it to someone else. So we have a quote from him. And he says, true, no one is commanded to distribute to others that which is required for his own needs and those of his household, nor even to give away what is reasonably required to keep up becomingly his condition in life, for no one ought to live other than becomingly. But when what necessity demands has been supplied, and one's standing fairly taken thought for, it becomes a duty to give to the indigent out of what remains over. And I think that's him quoting St. Thomas Aquinas, I believe.
Yep.
And I think he says it beautifully. Like, he's not saying, forsake your child and go take care of the person outside.
Well, in the New Testament episode, we said a man who does not take care of his own family is worse than a non-believer. Right? So basically, Aquinas quotes that, and Leo's quoting Aquinas, who quoted the Bible. So taking care of your family is necessary. To give somebody else something that your family absolutely needs would be wrong.
Right.
But, and you should perhaps, notice how he says, talking about living becomingly. he allows for a household to even do a little more than survive, but to maybe even thrive. Mm-hmm. If you notice, like, why do people want to travel to Europe so much? The European towns and villages, they were built under this philosophy that Leo is presenting. Mm. The window boxes, the ladies coming out every morning to sweep their front porch. Mm. Everything is pristine, perfect. People are going out of their way with time and expense to make their place beautiful. That's becomingly. Now, are these mansions? No, they're very, very modest houses, but kept to perfection.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And the town as a whole, the people of the town care very much what their town looks like.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
These old European towns, the most beautiful structures are public structures, the church, the town hall. Now, if you go to a lot of American towns, the mansion, the houses might be like McMansions, right? Big, and then the town center is like, you know, some like cheaply made strip mall kind of things, right? So it's the opposite. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about a becoming living, which is not like extravagant, but it is beautiful.
Yeah.
And once you're able to reach that level, which takes a lot of prudence and discernment, then you help the poor.
Right. Yeah, I love it. It's so balanced. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not, we're on the brink of survival, then we start helping those other people. But it's, and it's also not, I'm living in an extravagant lifestyle and giving a percent of it to the poor people. Mm-hmm. It's this responsibility to discern where you lie and to fulfill all your other duties, provide for my family, live becomingly, and provide for my neighbor. And it's a wonderfully balanced, beautiful way that Leo puts it out. And it's great. I think that this principle, honestly, to me, is one of my favorite, the stewardship one. It really reminds me to be a better Christian and to really think about everything that I have as God's. And it's wonderful. I think it's great.
I always think that Christians should be spontaneous in helping others. But I also personally have plans. I have plans that I created a long time ago that I'm executing to help others with my resources, but I also have plans for the future that I won't be able to execute for another 10 or 20 years. Right? But this is how I think we should all be thinking. I hate to use myself as an example. Jose Escriva would not be happy with me. But I do think it's something we should all be doing, is thinking ahead, like, oh, you know, this is my goal in helping others decades down the road. I think that's a good way of thinking. Yeah,
I agree. Absolutely. So next principle, we said we were going to fly through them, but we've been going kind of slow.
We're crawling. Sorry.
So the next one is the primacy of the family, which is a rather new one. I think it comes directly from Leo, and he gives a lot of attention to it.
So Leo dedicates entire paragraphs to it, but it also permeates the whole document if you look for it. And it's new and it's not. So I don't think it's ever been articulated so clearly as Leo articulates it. But you could find it all the way into the Bible, right? Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 says that the Son of God, the Messiah, right? The Son of Man will be coming on the clouds of heaven and will have an everlasting dominion. So everybody who's expecting Jesus, the Son of God, the Word made flesh, to come as like this political king, you know, destroy the Romans guy. Right. And how does he come? He comes as a baby in a family.
Right.
So the idea of the primacy of the family is a biblical concept, but I think it becomes so explicitly articulated by Leo because of the change in family structures that the industrial capitalistic world brings.
Yeah, I think you're right. So we had a quote before in season 1 of, I think it was a Chesterton quote, where he kind of highlights that change in structure, where he's saying that the industrialization has made men move closer to their jobs as opposed to their families.
To listen to their employers more than their parents.
Yeah, right. And I think we mentioned this in the beginning. That's kind of created this isolated nuclear family.
Let's ask the audience. Would you listen right now more to your employer, your boss, or your parents?
That's a good question. That's a good question for me. But yeah, let's jump into primacy of the family.
Well, our boss is a father.
That's true. Yeah, and I was going to say about the biblical connection, like, you know, it's in the commandments as well, to honor your mother and your father. And that's not only your immediate family, but also the spiritual thing that, you know?
Yeah, amen. So Leo says the basic building block of society is the family. John Paul II will say this decades later, where the family goes in society is where society will go. And he says that part of the reason for this is natural law. Aquinas and Leo love natural law. The family preexists the state. Name one government today that existed before the family. No one could do that, right? So because the family preexists the state, it is more important, it has more rights than the state. And the state does not have the right to impede upon the family.
Right.
Now, that means that children belong to their parents, which every reader today would be like, duh.
Yeah.
But back then, Marx and Engels and socialists in general were saying, no, children should be the property of the state, not families, which sounds so evil to me.
Yeah, and in very specific ways. They said that, like, you know, the state should be in charge of educating children when they're young and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't think Marx and Engels necessarily meant state take them from the household, but it was still extreme and evil.
Yeah.
Like, and I think Leo calls it evil.
Yeah, thanks for tempering me there. And then he says something interesting, Leo. He says that governments, while they can't impede and infringe upon the rights of families, that governments do have a responsibility to prop up struggling families.
Right. Yeah.
So that, again, I said that you can't put Leo in a box. Is he a right winger? Is he a left winger? I mean, he's sounding like neither and both throughout this.
That is true. I think he points this out beautifully, like all throughout. I do agree, and I didn't even think about that. This principle is kind of all throughout the document. You know, he not only points out the errors from socialists regarding the family, but he also points out why we need, you know, why family is good. He does it so articulately and so well all throughout the document, and you know, it's informed by the other principles. Again, like, I think that the state essentially must help the struggling families because of this responsibility of discernment that the state has. Like, the state, it's not just individuals that have this responsibility, but the state as well. And the state also has to be a steward of what they've been given by God.
Wow.
You know?
Yeah, because all power comes from God. I've never thought of that.
Yeah,
That's a really nice thought.
I think, I mean, and it's brilliant because these principles are all intertwined, and Leo brings them out so clearly.
Yeah. And the way Leo sees the responsibility of government and the state is so different than, like, the American way of thinking.
yeah.
Like, it's such, I still struggle today to think, like, oh, so the state really does have responsibility like that? I guess so. You know?
Yeah.
All right. Next, the preferential option for the poor.
Yeah.
So again, you can't put Leo in a box. He's not a Republican. He's not a Democrat. So there's this, like, governments, are they responsible for the poor? Are they? He says yes.
Yeah.
And governments should not be caring for one class of people and then just totally ignoring and acting unjustly towards other classes. That's no good. No one's proposing that. But the wealthy could take care of themselves.
Yeah.
More or less.
Yeah, and Leo says that.
They could hire great lawyers. They could use money to fix problems that they encounter. The poor don't have that. So this is an essential Catholic social teaching principle that every listener needs to just understand. This is binding. Governments should help the poor and make sure that they're assisting the poor, and that should be a special focus of the government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Leo even kind of uses this language to say that the poor or the working class, which are, you know, they're kind of similar to Leo, they're kind of synonymous.
Well, we'll get
almost,
into that.
right?
Yeah.
But he kind of says that they are also, in a sense, fundamental to society. Like, they kind of carry society in a way because they're the workers. They're the ones that get the work that we need done. And I think that
Just imagine an economy without workers.
Right. Yeah. Right? I know. And it's been heartwarming for me to see recently. I think there's been people kind of giving them kind of working class praise, you know, for, especially when I think, you know, when, like, one image I think of is when it's like freezing cold outside and there's like snowstorms, and, you know, there's still workers that have to go outside to, you know, carry the functions of, you know, like electricity and all these things. And it's bizarre, but they're so important. And there's a quote that I would like to read from Leo, because this one I think is really good. Like you said, Leo will say, the richer class have many ways of shielding themselves and stand less in need of help from the state, whereas the mass of the poor have no resources of their own to fall back upon. and must chiefly depend upon the assistance of the state. And it is for this reason that wage earners, since they mostly belong in the mass of the needy, should be especially cared for and protected by the government. And I think he just puts what we said into perfect words with that.
Yeah, he always says it better than we do. It's so funny. This is an aside. It's not under the subject of preference for the poor, but he associates wage earners, like proletarians, with the needy. So we're going to save that thought for later.
We'll do.
All right, so I think that's crystal clear. Let's move on to the next principle.
Which is agreement.
I grew up as an athlete, maybe even suffering from an addiction to competition. I just love the idea of competing in the economy.
And winning.
And, beating other people.
Yeah.
And seeing others as an opponent. And that was kind of like the basis of relationship in the economy, in the school. Like, was our big competitor in my Catholic school? Was it the Protestant church down the street? No, it was the other Catholic school that we played basketball against. Competition was the basis of our relationship, and the other people were the opponents, like the enemies. And to live in a society like that, it really breaks down solidarity, to see others as competitors. So what Leo is talking about here, and this is so hard for a person who has the background that I would have,
A chronic
let's say.
competitor.
Yeah, that agreement is a society that's better. It's so hard to comprehend this, but it's true, and I encourage everybody to challenge themselves to understand this. So in the guild system, when the price for a loaf of bread was determined for a city, was that price determined by competition or by agreement? It was by agreement. Multiple stakeholders would come together to make decisions like this. And what the church was involved, the baker, the master baker of the guild, even the poor being represented, so that the price was kind of favorable to all. And the preferential option for the poor was there.
Right, yeah.
The church was there as the conscience.
And the solidarity. Again, these are all built upon each other.
So today this would be illegal, price fixing. But the system back then was built on agreement, and as a result, there was a greater communal solidarity. And the different classes, the different levels of wealth, they saw each other as parts of a body, more so than as competitors.
Right.
So this system of agreement, or this idea of agreement in an economy is hard to understand, but it's even happening today. In the global fishing industry right now, there's this growing world human population in the world, and there's this major climate crisis going on, and there's overfishing. So how do these companies, which are sometimes publicly traded, how do they compete with each other? Well, the world fishing industry has decided, even competitors are coming together to agree on standards, on regulations, so that they could actually make more money.
Yeah.
And it's not a trust. It doesn't hurt the consumer, but they're coming together in the old way, in a new economy.
Yeah.
So it's not romantic, but it's a new principled approach that weighs many moral goods. Like, we need to make money.
Yeah.
But we also need to protect the fish, because if we don't have the fish, then we're all gonna be gone. So this idea of collaborating and agreeing and then competing is a very new and old thing.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. And I think in the document it needs to be sparsed out a little bit more than some of the other principles. It's a little less clear, but Leo definitely upholds it. And I think it's, for me, I keep trying to connect these. In my head, they're just connecting to the other principles. And this agreement feels built upon the solidarity, where it's like, because we want solidarity in our society, we need to use agreement as a tool almost.
Yes.
And he has a quote that we read part of it before, but I think the second half of the quote adds a little bit more intensity and makes it clearer about what agreement means. So Leo says, just as the symmetry of the human frame is the result of the suitable arrangement of the different parts of the body, so in a state it is ordained by nature that these two classes should dwell in harmony and agreement so as to maintain the balance of the body politic. And this is where we didn't read yet. Each needs the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. Mutual agreement results in the beauty of good order, while perpetual conflict necessarily produces confusion and savage barbarity.
You know what I'm hearing here? Hearts over systems.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not just the mechanics of the relationship between two parties, but it's also the way that they think.
Mm-hmm.
Is your employer your friend or your enemy?
Should be your friend.
That's not a mechanical thing. It's a philosophical thing. And if you're a worker and you see your employer as an enemy, it could be because your employer sees you, the worker, as an enemy. These are decisions that have to be made in the heart.
Yeah. The image I get is kind of the solutions from the capitalists or the socialists is how do we rearrange capital and labor to get the most productive system?
Mm-hmm.
But Leo and the church is how do we rearrange the people? The people that, not these tools and the mechanisms, but the people, and the capital and the labor will, in a way just become more order, like he says.
And what does this look like if it were to happen? Agreement over competition between capital and labor. Well, capital would go to labor and say, like, all right, a new year is coming up. How are things going? What do you need? How can I help?
Yeah.
And then the labor would say, like, oh, you're doing so well for us, thank you. We just need this one little thing. And that's this concept of agreement. Without anything else, you don't even need to change the law. It's just a way of thinking, right? And then the opposite. Let's say the employer's like, oh, I don't care about labor. Let them be them. I'm going to just try to make as much money as I can. And then labor is going to feel like they're not cared for, and they're going to have to form an association, and they're going to have to threaten to not work,
right,
just to get what they need, right? So there's just, this is philosophical.
Yeah. So I think that does it for agreement. And now we move on to, I think, our last, but kind of one of the longest principle, which we've called distributism. And it's something we've, I think, perhaps talked about some scholars before, like Belloc and Chesterton and others have used this kind of language. And I think it comes from Leo because he talks about distributive justice or distributive, a distributive economy.
Yep.
In a way.
Yep. So I think Leo only uses the root word distribute twice in this document. But the term distributism comes from those two uses. And it really becomes a movement in the early 1900s, just 20 years later. And people like Belloc and Chesterton and others begin a movement which some would even call distributism, which is an ism.
Yeah, it is an ism.
And we've said before, the church isn't in support of an ism and will never, because of the principle of subsidiarity, will never tell economies what to do. The church will provide principles and guidelines for how to act. But from there, it's freedom. Do whatever you want. So, and we mentioned that this is liberating. To give a set of ground rules, standards, but then to give freedom beyond that is a very liberating thing. So what we can't be doing is saying that distributism is an economic model like capitalism or socialism. It's not. It's one of many Catholic principles. And it should be taken into consideration, and because this is a doctrinal document, it's even binding.
Yeah.
But it's bound to us equally to the other principles that we've mentioned. And when we're making any economic decision as Catholics, we're not just being affected by one of these principles. We're being affected by a combination of all these principles. So that's enough about an introduction to the word distributism, all right? So Pope Leo has a quote that I would encourage every Catholic to memorize. And he says this. Let's see if I could remember it myself. The law should favor ownership and should induce as many people as possible to become owners.
Sounds right.
Okay? I think I got it. So the reason why it's important to memorize is because it should affect the way that we vote. It's not anti-American to think this way. It's not anti-anything. It's just a different way of thinking in regards to who owns what. What does Leo prefer? A society where very few people own property and the majority of the people are renting? Does he want the majority of business capital to be in just a few giant corporations?
No.
And everybody working for those
No.
giant corporations? So what is he saying? The law should favor ownership. So whatever legal structures that exist should encourage as many people as possible to own their house, not rent, to own the property that their house is on, not rent, to own their own means of production, not having to hire out their labor for a wage. That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
So what is he saying? He says the law should favor ownership and the law should induce as many people as possible to become owners. Let's say the amount of people who rented went way down in the United States and the amount of people who owned their property went up. Do you think that would increase the gap between rich and poor or decrease?
I think it would decrease the gap.
So this idea of distributism is the idea that less and less people are renters, more and more people are owners.
Yeah.
Less and less people are proletarians working, trading their labor for wages. More and more people are running their own operation,
Yeah.
owning their own means of production.
Yeah.
So imagine a society with fewer large corporations, fewer proletarians, many more small business owners. Mm-hmm. Picture a society with less apartments, with people earning rent, more single-family households with people owning their own property, making those properties beautiful, living becomingly. That's distributism.
Right. Yeah, I think this might be very reductionist, but distributism in my head right now kind of is defined by that line, that the law should favor ownership, or more people should own. It's kind of like with distributism. Yeah, it's like ownership should be distributed amongst as many people as possible. And it's not like it's not an ism like the others where it's like we're building this system. No, it's just this claim that more people should own because of the other principles on this list.
Distributism is the product of other principles that we've already mentioned.
And I think that the way I read Leo's use of distributism, I really do, I think, read it as almost like a tool, like this claim that the law should favor ownership or more people becoming owners is kind of the tool or thing that produces the fruits of these principles. So I think specifically he says, you asked if the gap would be bigger or smaller if more people owned, and we said smaller. And I think Leo says that himself. So to quote Leo, he says, if working people can be encouraged to look forward to obtaining a share in the land or ownership, the consequence will be that the gulf between vast wealth and sheer poverty will be bridged over, and the respective classes will be brought nearer to one another. And I think that's one of the fruits he mentions. And then he also mentions others, which I want to mention too. He also says that another consequence will result in the great abundance of the fruits of the earth. Men always work harder and more readily when they work on that which belongs to them. Nay, they learn to love the very soil that yields in response to the labor of their hands. Not only food to eat, but an abundance of good things for themselves and those that are dear to them. And I think that that's how you live becomingly, owning. And I think that these are fruits. Owning your property and the means of production make you love what you own and make you work harder. And I think that's why I think I read this as a tool, because he's saying these are the fruits of ownership. All the other principles kind of come from private property and ownership. And the more people that own, the better.
Amen. Amen. So now, all of a sudden, the primary principle makes sense. Because remember, telling a proletarian who has no way of advancing in the late 1800s that private property is a good thing, that's not helpful, Pope Leo, right? Until this idea of distributism comes in. If the laws change so that so that ownership is easier and even encouraged, then private property becomes possible. So that's one thing to mention here. Is distributism socialistic? So
Not
I think the
necessarily.
word could be a little bit of a because distributism is not an encouragement of the government distributing wealth through, for example, like a progressive tax system, which is essentially robbing the rich to give to the poor.
Like Robin Hood.
Like Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood's not a hero, according to Leo. Better than that is reshaping the laws. Remember, Leo was a lawyer, he was an economist. Changing the laws so that money tends to flow, money and capital tends to flow to more people. Belloc complains in the early 1900s that the industrial system, the capitalistic system, broke an economy in England that saw in the history of the world the greatest distribution of land and wealth that ever existed. Now, I don't think that there's any way to prove that he was right. And not everything that Belloc says is true and good. You know, there's plenty of things to criticize about what he says and his character, but it's an honest observation that he has, that the industrial and capitalistic system took people away from ownership. And what Leo is saying is we need to return not to the old system, but to a new system that encourages ownership. So distributism is not the government's redistribution of wealth. It's people being allowed and encouraged to acquire their own. Okay? And we think about the United States, its desire to get rid of the monarchy, to distribute political power. And it did so by having a couple hundred Congress people, 100 senators with 50 states, a whole bunch of jurors, administrative state, that fourth branch of government. And
biggest.
Yes, and most expensive. So in the United States, we've done such a good job of dividing power amidst the states and all the assemblies, all this stuff. But from an economic perspective, our antitrust laws still allow for as much of 80% of a giant industry to be dominated by like 4 companies. 4 is the magic number, according to Congress. You know, the way that they're doing this when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. So that is an incredible amount of power for a sector like accounting or banking or food. You know, essential things like food. Such a small number of big competitors. So in distributism, what we would see is more banks. And there's probably 5,000 banks in the United States. So you probably see that 80% in the big 4 shifting to the other 5,000 more so, and even more banks existing. So more is better. And is there a lot of repetition in more? Yes. But that's not so bad for labor, necessarily.
Right. Yeah, I think that we have, so how do I put this? I think that people are maybe starting to see that, or at least I've noticed that some people I know have started to recognize the issue of the lack of distribution in economic power. And we've talked about that in season 1. I think Leo's response almost feels a little maybe dissatisfying to some people because it's not forceful enough to say, you know, these laws must change or else, essentially.
Well, he's writing to the world.
Right. So it's almost a little dissatisfying because it's like, the state can't do this. The state can't take away and redistribute. He's just encouraging people to do it. So, like, how is this ever going to happen? You know, it may seem impractical to some people.
Well, he does say that it should be the laws that are influenced by these principles to favor one thing over another, to encourage one thing over another. Yeah,
that is true. And I think it's just maybe might feel dissatisfying because an individual might feel a little helpless compared to, like, you know, we're talking about these ginormous corporations owning so much of the means of production. And, you know, one individual may be like, you know what, I'm inspired by this episode and I want to do this, but they must feel like helpless almost.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So the encyclical is written to multiple audiences. If you look at the audience who's addressed, it's bishops. But of course, the assumption is that the bishops are giving this information to their people. So it's for everybody. Encyclical means circle, like everybody. There's multiple audiences here. There's governments that are being told, you know, what to do by Leo. There's individuals. And yeah, individuals may feel helpless, But one thing I would not do to a young man today is say, hey, Leo believes in distributism. He believes that you should be your own boss. You should own your own means of production. You should not be a proletarian who is selling your labor for wages. Because that's, according to the old way, like the definition of being in need, rather poor. I would not recommend to that young man today to quit his job with a full-time salary and benefits and to start his own business, which has a 1 out of 10 chance of succeeding, right? As Catholics, we need to practice temperance and prudence and understand that our job is to thrive and to live becomingly for the sake of our families. And we have to work within the reality of today. Is the law right now favoring the small business owner to start from scratch, or is the law favoring a young man to work for a giant corporation so that they could receive a salary with benefits and some sense of security in regards to health insurance, income? Which one does the law favor right now?
The latter.
The law favors the person who is in the corporate system right now. So Leo would say, we don't want to intentionally discriminate against large companies. No, large companies should be able to exist. We would never have iPhones without a large company. So large companies are okay, but the law should be favoring the person who is trying to own his or her own means of production, right? And that person should not be struggling to, let's say, find health insurance. Like there should be a system that makes it just as easy for that person to obtain health care. I'm not arguing for a single payer system there.
Yeah.
And also the taxes. There should be special tax incentives that make small business easier than, let's say, it would make it for a larger corporation.
Right. Yeah. And I appreciate your response, especially in the beginning where you talk about kind of like the need for temperance. And I think, this is addressed to multiple audiences, and each one of us has this responsibility and call to do what he asks to our capacity. Like me as an individual, I cannot change the law, full stop. But the administrative state has more capacity to do that, and they are also bound, as if Catholic, to listen to this. And I'm going to do as much as I can and deduce and discern what Leo's asking me to do, and I appreciate that. And I think that's true. And these questions about the law and individuals, because sometimes, even as an individual trying to do these things, sometimes you feel helpless anyway if you're doing as much as you can in your capacity. But I think so many topics come to mind about, renting versus owning, and like the question that you said about small businesses versus big businesses. And I think that those questions are ones we hope to address also. Yeah, like in light of this, in later podcasts.
Yeah, we'll have a whole episode in the future on like housing and things like that. But we're talking about two distributive elements: means of production and your labor and your work and all that, and then also your property, your living situation. So I think a very prudent stance to take in the economy of 21st century America, New Jersey, most people are going to have no choice but to be a proletarian. You just got to suck it up and recognize that that's the reality, unless you're in a very privileged position. But what is possible is to probably own your own little estate. That's probably possible. So you save enough, you act sparingly, as Pope Leo would say. You purchase your little property, you improve upon it, and that's something that you could even pass down to the next generation. So that's possible. And it's becoming, by the way, less and less possible today. So there's inventory shortages, which is an issue, but the laws right now, are the laws favoring ownership or rentership?
Rentership.
Now, New Jersey is one of the kindest places for renters. Believe it or not, there's a lot of laws that protect renters compared to like late 1800s United States. But I'll tell you what the law isn't doing in New Jersey. It protects renters, but it's not encouraging ownership. And the state law and the national laws, they should be doing things to help people obtain property. And there are federal and state programs, right? But I think that the rate of ownership is getting worse, not better.
Yeah. And it's a shame. I think we've mentioned Chesterton and Belloc before, and I think that they expressed similar concern when they were writing to the one that you just expressed now. But it's not all dire. I think that we'll read some of their concerns in light of what you've said. And then I think Leo offers not another solution, but this sort of almost like a Band-Aid, like a thing to help that person that may feel helpless. Like, this is what you can do in the meantime while hopefully the law changes and other people feel this responsibility. So we'll start with Chesterton and Belloc.
Sure.
So, and this touches on an idea we briefly touched on before, which is that Leo assumes that when he's talking about the working class, he's also in a sense talking about the poor, like he calls them kind of synonymous. And I think that Chesterton and Belloc agree with him. So the Chesterton quote is, "The truth is that what we call capitalism ought to be called proletarianism. The point of it is not that some people have capital, but that most people only have wages because they do not have capital." Which we've, I think, mentioned throughout. And we say now the law does not favor the ownership of your home or the means of production. So I think these quotes almost sound a little prophetic. You know, it got worse in a sense, maybe. And then Belloc's quote is, "The attitude of the proletariat towards property and towards that freedom which is alone obtainable through property is no longer an attitude of experience or of expectation. They think of themselves as wage earners. To increase the weekly stipend of the wage earner is an object which they vividly appreciate and pursue. To make them cease to be wage earners is an object that would seem to them entirely outside the realities of life." Which is a scary thought. He's kind of saying that people have, it's become the norm, like the natural thing to be this wage earner and to no longer be a wage earner, to follow this or to live these principles almost sounds fake. And you know, that's why I say some people may feel helpless.
Yeah, he's complaining about how people think
Yeah.
in his time. He's complaining that people think that they will improve their situation if they just get paid more money.
Right.
So they're always going to be proletarians. They're always going to be trading labor for wages. They just want more wages, right? And he thinks that that's crazy. So true wealth is owning your means of production and not being dependent on an employer for wages. That's what he thinks is best. So it's a different paradigm, different way of thinking of even what good is.
Yeah, and I think that it's almost like a wake-up call. And I said prophetic because it feels like many people I know, or just many people in general, still feel this way. They are wage earners, and maybe they're owning a little estate, or they have their mortgage to pay, but they're still under this idea that I'm a wage earner. This is never going to change, and they wouldn't even think of the word proletarian as being bad.
Right.
But they are proletarians, and to be fair, we also I and you are wage earners also.
yeah.
But we try to be influenced by these principles as much as we can.
And we could have influence without changing any laws here. Like, for example, when we decide to buy something, we could buy something from a small business or a larger one or a giant one,
like
or
Amazon.
a mega one, right? Yeah. So we should choose to, whenever we can, go small.
Right.
When we make a purchase.
Yeah.
We're going back to episode 1.
We are, yeah. And that'll come back later on, I think, too.
Yeah. And when we buy something, we want to make sure we're not buying something from anything that could potentially become a middleman that replaces all other middlemen. So we always want to make sure that it's not just who we're buying from, but how. We don't. If all products made by all companies somehow went through the filter of like one company and then came to us, and if we kept funding that one middleman, that one middleman could end up becoming an economic monarch.
Yeah.
And that's no good. So it's not just the producers, but the middlemen that we want to make sure we're distributing all of those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you think that we should talk about in regards to distributism? Or is it time to move to Leo's practical bandage for the situation?
Let's go into the bandage.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think one thing, we've expressed this potential feeling of helplessness for the wage earner or the proletarian. But one thing that Leo suggests towards the end of Rerum Novarum is this idea of private association, and very specifically Christian associations. I think in short, his advice is if you're a wage earner and you're not rich and you don't have the means to protect yourself like the rich do, and the state isn't doing it, find like-minded people and preferably this association, which is that protection, that is your stability that you can rely on. He said that once the guild systems disappeared, there's been no structure in society to protect the working man. So towards the end, he's like, this is sort of a bandage. Let's strive to find something that can be our support and stability. And that is these private Christian associations. Any specific examples or thoughts on that from Leo?
I think he is telling governments that workers should be allowed to assemble. So there was a time when governments would not allow that, which was definitely favoring employers over employees. Employers perhaps even lobbying, to use the best possible word, for government to not allow that, right? So allowing for workers to come together to protect their own rights against employers that are harsh and not protecting their dignity is something Pope Leo is calling for. He wants these associations to be religious and Christian because he sees the potential issue of these labor unions perhaps being just as bad as the employers. Basically being godless, not following any principles, but just like that harsh, almost Marxist competitiveness.
Yeah, the warfare.
Competition between employer and employee instead of harmony
and
agreement. So he wants them to be religious. He wants them to be moderate, temperate, prudent, guided by these principles. Also, just protecting themselves from employers that could be harsh. So let's say somebody in a proletarian economy gets injured. Who pays for that? This association perhaps is an opportunity for health insurance or life insurance or disability insurance. The Knights of Columbus came to be in this way. Basically, proletarians in harsh working conditions in New Haven, Connecticut. Yeah, New Haven, Connecticut. They all just, I think, put in initially $1. And when somebody died on the job, that widow would get all those dollars, and then everybody would put in another $1. That's it. So these associations were opportunities for Catholics and Christians to come together, share principles, and live a better life than if they were to be isolated and just at the total dependency of the employer.
Yeah, and I think that those associations, I think Leo is, like you said, Christian, and he's asking them to follow these principles. So that's why the Knights of Columbus could work. They're like, oh, we're stewards. We're going to help out our brothers, our neighbor.
And that's not a labor union. That's an association. So a union could be involved with what Leo is calling for here or not.
Yeah.
But what Leo doesn't want a labor union to be is to be a source of competitiveness.
Yeah,
he wants it to
that.
be a source of agreement, which we see in many cases is not the case with labor unions. And that's not to say that striking isn't a good thing sometimes. Sometimes it's necessary. If there's an obstinate pharaoh or employer, striking is going to be a need sometimes.
Yeah, and I think Leo's so balanced. He does that too. Like he makes that clear.
Yep.
But I think we're more or less at the end of Rerum Novarum. It's been a long episode.
Can I say one thing about this union thing?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Were you going to get me there anyway?
I wasn't, but
all right, I'd
love to hear it.
I don't think that Rerum Novarum ends with this Leo's call to assemble and create associations for the sake of protecting laborers. And what I want to say is that is not Leo's solution to capitalism and industrial economies. It's a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
So a lot of us might see Rerum Novarum as ending on the mountaintop with, all right, we want labor unions. That's not it.
Yeah.
Rerum Novarum is a mountain, and the peak is in the middle
of the document.
Maybe even paragraph 20. But I would just say the document as a whole is this non-romantic call for returning to first principles.
Right.
And he even adds some principles. So the peak of the document is those principles. And maybe even paragraph 20, where he's telling employers and employees how to think.
Yeah.
Like, it's very, very specific. But the purpose and the solution to this terrible economic situation is not unions. He's just saying, like, they should be allowed until we're able to build something that's fully in line with the principles of Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, I completely agree. When I thought of paragraph 20, I thought this honestly is the best paragraph for a conclusion. Like it should have gone at the end. I guess what we've done is we've, studied the whole document and brought out these principles, which I think are really helpful. And I think it's what Leo was trying to get at. So that's the purpose of this episode, was to try to condense this and walk through it, talk about it. So I hope that those principles help and that they're clear. And if they need to be clearer, please do read the document. So what I hope those principles do now, we'll conclude with paragraph 20, because I think that this, in a sense, could have been Leo's conclusion, because, it's the mountaintop. This is the climax, we think. But as I read it, I do want the audience to listen to it in light of the principles we just walked through, in light of all the conversation we just had about Leo's ideas, his principles, and his return to the principles, to the originalistic goodness of these principles. So I'll read paragraph 20. And toward the end, he has a bit of a sassy remark, which I kind of like, which kind of embodies, I think, his approach. Like, we don't need this new system, we need these principles. So pay attention to the last line, I would say. So paragraph 20. And again, he's using very binding language. He uses the word bound, should, duties. Again, this is doctrine. So let's listen to the Holy Father. Of these duties, the following bind the proletarian and the worker, fully and faithfully to perform the work which has been freely and equitably agreed upon. First, never to injure the property nor to outrage the person of an employer. Second, never to resort to violence in defending their own cause, nor to engage in riot or disorder. And third, to have nothing to do with men of evil principles, who work upon the people with artful promises and great results and excite foolish hopes which usually end in useless regrets and grievous loss. So those are the duties of the laborer, the proletarian, the worker, which apply today.
They do. And in the end, he's talking about the type of union leader that would be causing more rifts with employers.
Like Marx.
Oh, yeah, sure. Or any others. There's been plenty of good and bad examples of unions in the United States even, yeah.
Right. So then next are the duties for the employer. The following duties bind the wealthy owner and the employer. First, not to look upon their work people as their bondsmen, but to respect in every man his dignity as a person ennobled by Christian character. They are reminded that according to natural reason and Christian philosophy, working for gain is creditable, not shameful, to a man, since it enables him to earn an honorable livelihood. But to misuse men as though they were things in the pursuit of gain, or to value them solely for their physical powers, that is truly shameful and inhuman. Again, justice demands that in dealing with the working man, religion and the good of his soul must be kept in mind. Hence, this is the next duty. The employer is bound to see that the worker has time for his religious duties. Third, that he be not exposed to corrupting influences and dangerous occasions. And that, fourth, he be not led away to neglect his home and family or to squander his earnings. Furthermore, fifth, the employer must never tax his work people beyond their strength or employ them in work unsuited to their sex and age. Sixth, his great and principal duty is to give everyone what is just. So I think that's kind of number one, but it's the sixth one he lists. Doubtless, before deciding whether wages acts fair, many things have to be considered, but wealthy owners and all masters of labor should be mindful of this, that to exercise pressure upon the indigent and the destitute for the sake of gain, and to gather one's profit out of the need of another, is condemned by all laws, human and divine. That, I think, is a really weighty line, because there's this divine sanction. But we'll continue. To defraud anyone of wages that are his due is a great crime which cries to the avenging anger of heaven. More weightiness. Behold, the hire of laborers which by fraud has been kept back by you crieth, and the cry of them hath entered into the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. Lastly, this is the last duty, the rich must religiously refrain from cutting down the workman's earnings, whether by force, by fraud, or by usurious dealing, and with all the greater reason, because the laboring man is, as a rule, weak and unprotected, and because his slender means should in proportion to their scantiness be accounted sacred. So those are all the principles, the precepts, the duties, and then this is the sassy line, which I think Leo is basically like, this is the advice, follow it. He says, were these precepts carefully obeyed and followed out, would they not be sufficient of themselves to keep under all strife and all its causes?
You know what I never see in this long paragraph is a mathematical formula. It's a philosophical way of thinking for both employers and employees.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's hearts first.
Yeah, absolutely. And he says, if you follow it, wouldn't it work? Mm-hmm. And I would listen to Leo.
He knows what he's talking about.
Exactly. And I think that's it for episode 1 of season 2.
Episode 2 is going to be Quadragesimo Anno, which comes out 40 years later.
Yeah.
1931.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned before, the fact that this encyclical has other encyclicals named after it, essentially, really points out to how important this one is for Catholic social teaching.
Yes.
But this has been wonderful. This is one of my most anticipated episodes. This is one of my favorite documents in the Papal Magisterium.
Let me just finish with one thought.
Please do.
Rerum Novarum is not the end of Catholic social teaching. It's the beginning. So one error could be that you read this document and then you think you know everything about Catholic social teaching on economics, which actually happens. But this is a late 1800s document. There's many more to come, and there will be clarifications. There'll be not changes, but refinements. The world will change, and we need to change along with the documents as time progresses. So let this not be the sole understanding of economics and Catholic social teaching.
Absolutely. And I think we'll get to the rest in the episodes to come. So thank you for listening to season 2, episode 1. See you next time.